All right, hello once again, Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD 1000 Web Development Technologies course, I've been creating a series of video presentations that are based off of the Mozilla Developer Network Learn Web Development series. I'm in the tools and testing, and we're talking client-side JavaScript frameworks. All right, this is the second part of the lecture. So we've started to look at some frameworks and why they're there, why we use them, etc. And we're up to other things that frameworks give us. So they want to show some more of the advantages. All right. And it says here tooling. Because each of the frameworks in this module have a large active community, the ecosystem of each provides tooling that provides the developer experience. So in other words, they've already got some pre-written software to make things easier for you to use. And they mentioned, for example, testing and linting. All right. Compartmentalization. Most major frameworks encourage developers to abstract the different parts of their user interface into components. In other words, they chunk. All right. And in many ways, when I start to explain this to students, a lot of times I use the analogy of like writing an outline where you go from very general to very specific. Well, we can do the same kind of thing here. And as it says, we can take the code that we're working on and break it up into components that communicate with one another. There are a lot of advantages to doing that. One advantage is that each component is doing just one thing, and that's what it should be done. And going along with that, if it turns out that that one thing that it has to do is complex, you can have, and maybe there's hundreds of things that have to be done. You can have a team of developers work together then. All of the code related to a given component can live in one file or in a number of files, depending on how you set it up. So the developer knows exactly where to go to make changes. In a vanilla JavaScript app, you'd have to, this would be much more difficult. Routing, and again, we will talk much more about routing and what this is and how it's used, etc., a little bit later on in this series of videos. But as it says, the most essential feature of the web is that it allows users to navigate from one page to the other. I mean, isn't that what the web is? As it says, it's a network of interlinked documents. When you follow a link on this website, for example, your browser communicates with a server and then fetches new content. So if I wanted to go to another page, I'd be able to do that. As it does so, what's in here in your address bar will change. All right. Your browser remembers your navigation history and allows you to navigate back and forth. So I can go here, which is where I was before, and I can go back to here, etc., known as server-side routing. Modern web applications, as mentioned here, typically do not fetch and render new HTML files. They load a simple shell and continually update the document object model inside of it. This is also referred to as a SPA, or a single-page application. All right. When a SPA is complex enough, it is important to bring routing functionality into the application. Again, if you're going and got a lot of pages that you're perusing to or allowing the user to peruse back and forth between. When routing is handled by the client side, it's a client side routing. And we just mentioned about server side routing as well. It's possible to make a router using the native capabilities of JavaScript in the browser, but these frameworks have companion libraries to make it more intuitive, and that's what you're shooting for. So some things to consider when you're using frameworks. As it says here, being an effective web developer means using the most appropriate tools for the job. JavaScript frameworks make front-end development, I would change that to easier, but they're not a silver bullet that solves all problems. All right. Just like vanilla JavaScript, frameworks take time to learn and have their quirks. You've got to have familiarity with the tool that you're using. So you should take time to learn it before you start to use it. Over-engineering, as mentioned here, if your project is something small with just a few pages, a framework might not even be necessary. The stuff that we end up creating in the AWD 1000 class really and truly doesn't need to do any work with a framework. All right. Larger code base and abstraction. As mentioned there, frameworks allow you to write more declarative code, sometimes less code overall, by dealing with DOM interactions for the user behind the scenes. It says this is great for your experience as a developer, but it isn't free. In order to translate what you write into DOM changes, frameworks have to run their own code, which will make your project larger, more expensive to operate, possibly, and probably slower to load too. Some extra code is inevitable. All right, but it says it's still a factor to keep in mind when you consider your app's performance. The abstraction of frameworks affects not only your JavaScript, but your relationship with the very nature of the web. No matter how you build for the web, the layer that your users ultimately interact with is HTML. Frameworks are not the source of problems, it says. With the wrong priorities, it's possible for any application to be bloated, for you to put stuff in that you don't need. All right, but frameworks can add to that, is what they're saying here. All right. Next, accessibility. We've had our own section already on accessibility, so you've heard some of this stuff already. But as mentioned there, making user interfaces accessible requires some thought and some effort, and frameworks can complicate that process. In some cases, as mentioned here, framework apps create accessibility barriers that don't exist in traditional websites, especially with things like client-side routing. With traditional server-side routing, navigating the web has predictable results. With client-side routing, your browser is not loading new pages, so it doesn't know that it should automatically adjust the focus, etc. The upshot, as it says, is that you should carefully consider accessibility from the get-go. We've talked about this before. All right, how to choose a framework. Each of the frameworks discussed in this module takes a different approach to web application development. It says there's a few questions that you should ask yourself. What browsers does the framework support? What domain-specific languages does the framework utilize? Does the framework have a strong community? And most of them do. The table in this section, it says, provides a glanceable summary of each. Broadly speaking, domain-specific languages are programming languages relevant in specific areas of software development. So when we look at here, again, this is the one we're going to be talking about. We're going to be using React. And notice that basically it has support of all modern browsers, as really do all of these. Our preferred DSL, or our preferred, as we just looked at, domain-specific language will be JSX. All right. I don't know if we talk any about TypeScript in here or not. There again, as it says, React browser official support documents. Does the framework have a strong community? It says this is the hardest metric to measure, but I would not disagree, but I would just say that the little bit I've looked at it with all these, they do have a strong community. All right. And there are places that you can go on the web to find out information. Opinions on the web. All right. It says the State of JavaScript survey is a collection of feedback of JavaScript developers that we could take a look at. Not going to, but you could. All right. Alternatives to client-side frameworks. If you're looking for tools to expedite the web development process and you know your project isn't going to require intensive client-side JavaScript, there's other things you could use, such as a CMS or content management system, server-side rendering, or a static site generator. CMSs, as it says right there, are tools that allow the user to create content for the web without directly writing the code themselves. They're a good solution for large projects, especially projects that require input from content writers who have limited code ability. WordPress is a good example. All right. I'm in the middle right now of creating a WordPress site for a person, and this person that I'm creating the site for, she does not know how to use WordPress. However, at her job, She is a special education teacher. She uses software that's very similar to WordPress. It's a very intuitive type of package. I have used Joomla before and I've taught Joomla. I think personally Joomla is harder to use than WordPress, but they do a very similar type of thing. And there's also Drupal, and there's even other ones. All right. Server-side rendering, as it says, is an application architecture in which it is the server's job to render a single-page application. In other words, the opposite of client-side rendering. All frameworks covered in this module support server-side rendering as well as client-side. Finally, here we've got static site generators. As mentioned, they're programs that dynamically generate all the web pages of a multiple-page website. They create components that are typically referred to as templates. The only one of these that I've looked at is I attended a webinar on Gatsby. All right, I've heard of Jekyll, I've heard of Hugo and Eleventy. All right, but the Gatsby one, the guy basically created the equivalent of a portfolio, and he wrote almost no code. All right, as it says, that brings us to the end of our introduction of frameworks. All right, in the next article, we start to go into a lower level. So that'll be the main features. And again, remember, after that, we will go in and do the React. I'm skipping the Ember, I'm skipping the Vue, I'm skipping the Svelte, I'm skipping the Angular. So after we do this next section on framework main features, we're going to jump right into React.